The date is June 6, 1944. On the blood-soaked sands of Utah Beach, amidst the deafening chaos of D-Day, American paratroopers of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment are fighting their way inland. They are exhausted, battle-hardened, and expecting to see only one kind of enemy: German soldiers. But after overrunning a German position, they find something that defies all logic. Cowering in a captured bunker is a group of soldiers in the Feldgrau uniform of the German Wehrmacht. But one of them is different. He is small, terrified, and very clearly Asian. Through the haze of battle and the fog of language, the Americans try to communicate. They shout questions in German, but he doesn't seem to understand. They try English, then French. Nothing. He just babbles in a language no one on that beach can identify. To the young GIs from Ohio and Pennsylvania, this is an impossibility. A ghost from the wrong continent, wearing the wrong uniform, fighting in the wrong war. They don't know it yet, but they have just captured a living paradox. A man who began this war as a soldier of the Japanese Empire was then forced to fight for the Soviet Red Army, and now, somehow, has ended his war fighting for Nazi Germany on the coast of France. His name, they would eventually learn, was Yang Kyung-jong, and his story is not one of loyalty or ideology, but of the brutal, indifferent current of history and the desperate human will to simply survive it. To understand how a Korean farmer's son found himself in a German uniform at Normandy, we must rewind, back to a time and a place that the world has largely forgotten. The year is 1938. The world is a powder keg, but for a young man named Yang, born in a small town in northern Korea, the world is already at war. His homeland doesn't even exist as an independent nation. For decades, Korea has been a colony of the Japanese Empire, its culture suppressed, its people treated as second-class citizens, and its resources plundered for the glory of Emperor Hirohito. This was not a benevolent rule. It was a systematic attempt to erase an entire national identity. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, speak the Japanese language, and worship at Shinto shrines. And as Japan's imperial ambitions grew, as its armies marched deeper into China, the empire needed more bodies to feed into the furnace of its war machine. They turned to their colonies. In 1938, Japan enacted the National Mobilization Law, and with it, the lives of millions of Koreans were irrevocably altered. A military draft was imposed. It wasn't a choice, it was a command. At the age of 18, Yang Kyung-jong was conscripted, not into a Korean army, but into the Kwantung Army, the most powerful and aggressive branch of the Imperial Japanese Armed Forces. His first posting was not to defend his home, but to occupy someone else's. He was sent to Manchukuo, the puppet state Japan had carved out of northeastern China. This was a brutal, unforgiving frontier, a vast windswept land of punishing winters and scorching summers, patrolled by Japanese soldiers who ruled over the local Chinese population with an iron fist. For a young Korean conscript, this was a life of harsh discipline, constant vigilance, and deep alienation. He was serving an empire that despised his own people, fighting for a cause that was not his own, in a land that was foreign to everyone involved. He was a tool, a number, a disposable asset in Japan's grand strategic game, and that game was about to bring him face to face with an entirely new enemy. For on the other side of the border, beyond the rolling grasslands of Manchuria, lay the Soviet Union. Two ruthless expansionist empires, Japan and the USSR, stared each other down across a tense and poorly defined frontier. It was a place of constant skirmishes and provocations, a Cold War that was about to turn blisteringly hot. In the summer of 1939, a border dispute over a tiny, insignificant river escalated into one of the largest and most consequential battles of the pre-war era, the battles of Khalkhin Gol. This was a clash of titans. On one side, the Japanese Kwantung Army, supremely confident, steeped in the warrior code of Bushido, but equipped with outdated tactics and light tanks. On the other, the Soviet Red Army, commanded by a then unknown general named Georgy Zhukov. Zhukov brought with him the future of warfare: massed artillery, coordinated air power, and vast formations of superior tanks. For the Japanese soldiers on the ground, including Yang Kyung-jong, it was a slaughter. They charged with bayonets against machine guns, They ran with explosives towards Soviet tanks. Their bravery was immense, but it was futile against the sheer industrial might of the Red Army. In the midst of this inferno, Yang Kyung-jong's first life as a soldier ended. He was captured by the Soviets. His Japanese uniform was stripped from him, and he was thrown into a world of unimaginable suffering. He was no longer a soldier of the emperor. He was a prisoner of Stalin. He was shipped deep into the Soviet interior, to one of the infamous gulags, a labor camp in the frozen wastes of Siberia. Here, ideology and nationality meant nothing. There was only the brutal calculus of survival, the freezing cold, the gnawing hunger, the back-breaking work, and the ever-present threat of death from exposure, starvation, or a guard's bullet. For 3 years, Yang endured this living hell, a forgotten casualty of a forgotten battle, thousands of miles from his Korean home. But the great gears of history were turning once more. In June of 1941, Adolf Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. The German Wehrmacht smashed across the Soviet border, annihilating entire Red Army divisions. The Soviet Union was pushed to the brink of collapse. The losses were catastrophic, numbering in the millions. The regime grew desperate, willing to do anything, sacrifice anyone, to halt the German advance. And in their desperation, Soviet commissars looked at their sprawling network of gulags, not as prisons, but as a vast, untapped reserve of manpower. In 1942, amidst severe manpower shortages, the Red Army began forcibly conscripting prisoners from the labor camps. They offered them a simple, grim choice: continue to rot and die in the frozen wasteland of the Gulag, or put on a Soviet uniform and fight the Germans on the Eastern Front. For Yang Kyung-jong and tens of thousands of other prisoners, it was no choice at all. It was a chance, however slim, to escape a certain death for a probable one. And so the young Korean man who had been forced to fight for Imperial Japan was now handed a Mosin Nagant rifle, dressed in the uniform of the Red Army, and sent to fight for Joseph Stalin. He was thrown into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, the most savage and brutal theater of the entire Second World War. Here life was cheaper than ammunition. He fought in the Third Battle of Kharkiv in 1943, a chaotic and desperate struggle in eastern Ukraine. The city changed hands multiple times as German and Soviet forces tore each other apart in brutal street-to-street fighting. Once again, Yang was not fighting for a cause. He wasn't a communist fighting against fascism. He was a man fighting to see the next sunrise. The language of his comrades had changed, the color of his uniform had changed, but the terror and the desperation remained exactly the same. And then the cycle repeated itself. During the ferocious German counter-offensive that retook the city, Yang's unit was overwhelmed. For the second time in his young life, he was captured. He threw down his Soviet rifle and raised his hands, this time to soldiers wearing the Feldgrau of the German Wehrmacht. He had now been a soldier for Japan and a soldier for the Soviet Union. He was now a prisoner of Nazi Germany. He was a man without a country, a man who had fought on both sides of the Axis-Soviet conflict, a man whose journey was still, unbelievably, not yet over. His captors saw an Asian face in a Soviet uniform, just another piece of human flotsam washed up by the relentless tide of war on the Eastern Front. They had no idea of the path he had already walked, and they could never have imagined the final impossible chapter of his odyssey that was yet to come. To understand how a Korean man captured in a Soviet uniform could possibly end up wearing the Feldgrau of the German Wehrmacht, we must first descend into the particular hell of the Nazi-Soviet War. This was not a conflict governed by conventions or chivalry. It was an ideological war of annihilation. For the millions of Soviet soldiers who surrendered or were captured, the German prisoner of war camps were not places of internment. They were instruments of extermination. Unlike British or American prisoners, who were afforded some protection under the Geneva Convention, Soviet prisoners were deemed subhuman by Nazi racial theory. They were part of the Judeo-Bolshevik conspiracy that Germany had sworn to eradicate. The result was a death rate of almost 60%. Millions of men were herded into open-air enclosures with no shelter from the brutal Russian winter. They were starved deliberately, fed watery soup and sawdust bread, if they were fed at all. Disease, typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis ran rampant. Summary executions were common. For Yang Kyung-jong, stripped of his Soviet uniform and cast among a sea of starving men, the horror was familiar, yet somehow worse. In the Gulag, there was at least the pretense of labor. Here, there was only the slow, grinding process of being erased from existence. This was the terrifying reality that formed the backdrop for his third, impossible choice. This was the certain death he now faced. But by 1943, the strategic situation for Germany had changed dramatically. The catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad had torn the heart out of the Sixth Army. The war of annihilation was consuming German manpower at an unsustainable rate. On the vast plains of the east, the Wehrmacht was bleeding, and there were not enough German men to staunch the wound. This created a profound paradox, a direct conflict between Nazi ideology and military necessity. The very people they deemed racially inferior, the Untermenschen they were actively exterminating in the camps, were now looked upon as a potential solution to their crippling manpower shortage. This was the birth of the Ostlegionen, the Eastern Legions. It was a desperate, pragmatic and ideologically fraught gamble. Initially, the idea was championed by Wehrmacht officers on the ground who saw the potential in turning anti-communist sentiment among Soviet minorities into a military asset. They argued that many Ukrainians, Georgians, Cossacks and Turkic peoples had suffered greatly under Stalin and would willingly fight to overthrow his regime. High-ranking Nazi ideologues, like Heinrich Himmler, were initially appalled by the concept of arming Slavic and Asiatic peoples. But as the German casualty lists grew longer and the Red Army grew stronger, pragmatism began to chip away at racial dogma. The decision was made. The Reich would recruit from its own prison pens. The process was a grim charade of choice. German officers, often accompanied by collaborators from the same ethnic groups, would arrive at the camps. They would separate the prisoners by nationality, singling out non-Russians. To men who were little more than walking skeletons, who hadn't eaten a solid meal in months, they made an offer. It was a devil's bargain. "Join us," they would say. "Fight against Stalin, the man who sent you to your death. In our service there is food. There are warm clothes, boots, a rifle." The alternative was unspoken but hung in the air, thick as the stench of death in the camp. Stay here and perish. For Yang, this moment must have felt like a recurring nightmare. He was an outsider among outsiders. He was not Ukrainian, not Georgian, not Cossack. He was a Korean, a man from a land most Germans had never even heard of. He understood little of the language, but he understood the universal language of survival. He saw the emaciated men around him, their eyes lighting up with a flicker of hope at the promise of a piece of bread. He saw the cold finality in the eyes of the German guards. He had no political stake in this war. He was not fighting for Hitler's vision of a new world order any more than he had been fighting for Stalin's. He was fighting for his own life, a battle he had been waging since the day a Japanese officer first thrust a rifle into his hands. And so, for the third time, he made the only choice he could. He stepped forward. He was now part of an Ostbataillon, an Eastern battalion. These units were a motley collection of men from across the Soviet Empire, thrown together under German command. Their quality, loyalty and equipment varied wildly. Yang and his comrades were given second-rate German uniforms, often lacking proper insignia and equipped with a mix of German and captured Soviet weapons. The training was rudimentary. These were not considered elite troops destined for the frontline assaults. The German High Command never fully trusted them. They were seen as Hilfswillige or Hiwis, auxiliary volunteers, expendable bodies to fill gaps in the line. And by late 1943 and early 1944, a very large gap had appeared not in the east but in the west. The Allied threat of an invasion of France, the long-awaited Second Front, loomed over the German war effort. Hitler became obsessed with fortifying the coastline, creating his much-vaunted Atlantic Wall. But where would the troops come from? The best, most experienced German divisions were desperately needed to hold back the relentless tide of the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Pulling them out would risk a total collapse. The solution, once again, was the Ostlegionen. The German command made a strategic calculation. These eastern battalions were deemed too unreliable for the fluid, high-intensity warfare of the Russian front, where desertion or defection was a constant risk. But for static defense, for manning bunkers and coastal batteries in France, they were considered adequate. They would be thousands of kilometers from their homes, separated from their people, with the vastness of German-occupied Europe between them and the Soviet lines. The chance of them switching sides here seemed minimal. And so a massive transfer began. Tens of thousands of soldiers from Georgia, Ukraine, Azerbaijan and beyond were loaded onto trains and shipped across the continent. Somewhere in this vast logistical movement was Yang Kyung-jong. We can only imagine his journey. A Korean in a German uniform traveling through Poland, through Germany, into occupied France. Watching a foreign world pass by from the slats of a cattle car, a world he had no connection to, on his way to fight for a cause he did not believe in, against an enemy he had never met. He was now assigned to the 709th Static Infantry Division, a low-grade unit responsible for defending the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. His specific unit was the Ostbataillon 795, a battalion made up largely of former Soviet prisoners, commanded by German officers. Their job was simple: occupy the fortifications overlooking the beaches, watch the grey waters of the English Channel, and wait. He arrived in a landscape that could not have been more different from the frozen steppes of Ukraine or the dusty plains of Manchuria. This was a land of green hedgerows, ancient stone farmhouses, and a coastline pounded by Atlantic waves. Here, Yang and his fellow soldiers dug trenches, laid minefields, and manned machine gun nests. They were far from the main ideological struggle of the war, a forgotten footnote in the grand strategy of the Third Reich. They were simply placeholders, a thin grey line of desperate men put there to absorb the first shock of an invasion they were told was inevitable. For Yang Kyung-jong, the soldier of 3 armies, the final, most violent chapter of his odyssey was about to begin. He had crossed all of Asia and all of Europe, only to find himself on a windswept beach in northern France, staring out at the horizon, waiting for the largest amphibious invasion in human history to come crashing down upon him. The waiting was its own form of torture. For a man who had already survived the vast frozen emptiness of the Soviet winter and the scorching dust of the Manchurian border, this damp, clinging chill of Normandy was a different kind of purgatory. The air was thick with salt and the smell of wet wool. At night, the wind howled around the concrete bunkers, a mournful sound that seemed to carry the ghosts of 1,000 drowned sailors. By day, the sky was a canvas of oppressive grey, mirroring the churning sea below. There was no grand purpose here, no stirring speeches from fanatical officers. There was only the gnawing damp, the thin soup that tasted of rust, and the endless crushing boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror whenever a lone Allied reconnaissance plane would buzz overhead. He shared his position with other men whose faces were maps of exhaustion and displacement. There was a Georgian who had once been a school teacher, a Ukrainian farmer who still muttered about his lost livestock, and a quiet man from the Caucasus who would carve intricate figures into scraps of wood with a dull knife. They communicated in a broken pidgin of Russian and German, their shared language not of words, but of mutual desperation. They were all ghosts, men whose past lives had been incinerated in the furnace of the Eastern Front. They wore the uniforms of their captors, carried their weapons, but their eyes held no loyalty. Their only allegiance was to the next sunrise, the next meager meal, the next moment they were not dead. Yang, the Korean, was perhaps the most spectral of them all, an anomaly within an anomaly, his thoughts a language no one else could possibly comprehend. Did he think of his home, a world away? Or had the constant trauma cauterized those memories, leaving only the hardened instinct to survive? We have no diary, no letters home from this time. All we have is the cold logic of his situation. To understand his world, you have to imagine the sensory details, the constant chafe of the poor quality German uniform on his skin, the metallic taste of the water from his canteen, the acrid smell of cheap ersatz tobacco smoked by the German NCOs, who regarded him and his comrades with undisguised contempt, and above all, the sound, the ceaseless rhythmic crash of waves on the shore, a sound that drilled into the skull, a constant reminder of the immense hostile force gathering just over the horizon. Every day was the same. Watch the water, clean the machine gun, huddle for warmth, try not to think, waiting, always waiting. Then in the pre-dawn blackness of June 6, 1944, the waiting ended. It didn't start with a warning or a trumpet call. It started with a sound that was not a sound, but a physical force, a deep subterranean roar that vibrated up from the soles of his feet, through his bones and into the base of his skull. The very air seemed to tear apart. Out on the dark water, the horizon erupted in a continuous rippling line of brilliant orange flashes. This was the voice of the Allied fleet, a chorus of 16-inch naval guns speaking in a language of pure destruction. The world dissolved into a cataclysm of noise and violence. The ground bucked and heaved like a living thing. Concrete dust rained down inside the bunker, filling his throat and stinging his eyes. The air became a thick, choking soup of cordite and pulverized earth. Men screamed, not in German or Russian, but in the universal primal language of terror. When the first hint of grey light bled into the sky, he peered through the firing slit and saw the impossible. The sea was gone. In its place was a solid, sprawling forest of steel. Ships. More ships than he could have conceived existed in the entire world, stretching from one end of the horizon to the other. And above them, the sky was black with aircraft, a dense, angry swarm of bombers and fighters that blotted out the dawn. The noise was no longer a series of explosions, but a single unbroken, deafening wall of sound that erased all thought. This wasn't a battle. This was an apocalypse. This was the industrial might of the modern world arriving to grind his small, forgotten corner of the coast into dust. The German NCO was shouting, his face pale and spittle flying from his lips, but his words were meaningless, swallowed by the maelstrom. The landing craft came next, dark shapes emerging from the smoke and mist, relentlessly churning toward the shore. They were like insects, a plague of them, and as they hit the sand, they vomited forth streams of men, American soldiers. They looked impossibly tall and well-fed, moving with a purpose that Yang and his fellow conscripts had lost long ago. The MG-42 machine gun in his bunker, the weapon they called Hitler's buzzsaw, opened up, its terrifying high cyclic rate of fire adding to the din. For a few frantic, chaotic minutes, they were soldiers again, firing their weapons at the figures swarming the beach. But it was like trying to stop the tide with a teacup. Shells screamed in, landing with titanic crumps that threw men into the air like broken dolls. The fortifications around them, which had seemed so solid just an hour before, were being systematically dismantled. Concrete shattered, trenches collapsed. The thin grey line was breaking, dissolving under the sheer, overwhelming pressure. He didn't know when the order came to retreat or if it ever did. All he knew was that the bunker had become a tomb. The NCO was gone. The Georgian schoolteacher lay in a heap, his face a mask of surprise and blood. Chaos reigned. Men were running, throwing down their weapons, trying to scramble back toward the relative safety of the hedgerows. It was a desperate, panicked flight. Yang joined them. He was no longer a soldier of the Wehrmacht, no longer a part of the 709th Static Infantry Division. He was just a man, running for his life through a landscape that was being actively unmade by explosives. The air sang with bullets. The ground shook. He dove into a waterlogged ditch as a shell landed where he had been standing, the concussion lifting him and slamming him back into the mud. His ears rang, his vision swam, and the only thought in his mind, the single burning instinct that had carried him across continents and through empires, was survive. He was captured not on the beach, but inland. Huddled behind a thick Normandy hedgerow, his German helmet lost, his rifle abandoned, he was found by a group of American paratroopers. They were grim-faced, exhausted men, their faces painted for camouflage, their uniforms torn. They had been fighting since the middle of the night. When they saw him, they paused. The exhausted terror on their faces gave way to pure, unadulterated confusion. Here in the middle of France was a man in a German field grey uniform, but his face was not the one they had been trained to kill. He was Asian. They shouted at him in English, a language he didn't understand. He raised his hands, babbling the few words of German he knew. Kein Schießen, kein Schießen! Don't shoot. Then, perhaps out of sheer desperation, or a fragment of memory from his first capture, he tried Russian. The confusion on the Americans' faces deepened. Who was this man? An enigma in a torn uniform, a living embodiment of the war's bewildering global chaos. For Yang Kyung-jong, the gunfire was finally over. He had survived his third army and his third collapse. He was now a prisoner of the Americans, a man without a country, a cause or a language to explain the impossible journey that had brought him to this muddy field in France. The confusion of his American captors was just the beginning of the final, and perhaps most bewildering chapter of his war. Yang Kyung-jong was processed not as a German, nor a Russian, nor a Japanese soldier, but as a historical anomaly. He was shipped across the English Channel, a prisoner bound for a camp in Britain, one more face among the tens of thousands of defeated Axis soldiers. But he was different. In the monotonous grey world of the POW camp, his story, painstakingly pieced together through translators and sheer persistence, began to circulate. It was a tale so improbable, so absurdly tragic, that it sounded like a fabrication. A Korean, forced into the Kwantung Army by the Japanese, captured by the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol, pressed into the Red Army, captured by the Germans at Kharkiv, and then forced into the Wehrmacht, only to be captured by the Americans on D-Day. It was the entire global conflict, the clash of ideologies and empires, distilled into the biography of one unwilling participant. The man credited with first documenting this unbelievable odyssey was Lieutenant Robert Brewer of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. He saw past the dirty uniform and the linguistic puzzle to the human story beneath. He saw a man who had not fought for a flag, a Führer or an emperor. He had fought for his next breath. For Yang, the end of the war in 1945 did not bring a triumphant return home. It brought a profound and terrifying question. Where was home? Korea, his birthplace, was a land now divided by the very powers that had captured him, soon to be engulfed in its own devastating war. To return would be to leap from one fire into another. And so he remained a man adrift, a displaced person on a continent littered with millions just like him, the human debris of a world torn apart. He was granted his release from the camp, but he was a man without a passport, without a nation to claim him. His journey, however, was not over. In a final, ironic twist of fate, the man who had been captured by the Americans chose to build his new life in their country. He emigrated to the United States in 1947, settling in Illinois near Chicago. The soldier who had survived the frozen steppes of Russia and the shell-shattered beaches of Normandy faded into the quiet anonymity of American suburbia. He married, raised a family of 2 sons and a daughter, and for 40 years lived a life of unremarkable peace. He almost never spoke of the war, not of the uniforms he wore or the horrors he witnessed. The past was a locked room, its ghosts too terrible to confront. He had spent his youth being defined by empires, his body used as a tool for their ambitions. In America, he finally had the chance to define himself simply as a husband, a father, a man. He had survived, and his survival was his silent victory. He died in his home in 1992, a citizen of the country that had been his final enemy on the battlefield. But the story of Yang Kyung-jong refused to remain a private one. That single haunting photograph taken in 1944 of a bewildered Asian man in a German uniform, surrounded by his American captors, became an icon of the war's sheer global scale and absurdity. It is an image that forces us to look beyond the simple narratives of good versus evil, of Allied versus Axis. It asks a more complicated question. What does it mean to be an enemy? Yang Kyung-jong's existence complicates our understanding of history. He is a ghost of 3 fallen regimes, a living testament to the coercive power of 20th century ideologies. He was a victim of Japanese imperialism, Soviet communism, and German Nazism, all in the span of 6 years. His body was a battlefield upon which the world's great powers fought. His legacy is not that of a warrior. He won no medals, led no heroic charges, and held no strategic importance. His importance lies in his very powerlessness. He represents the countless millions whose lives were not shaped by choice, but by conscription, by coercion, by the brutal lottery of geography and birth. He is a human pinball, shot across the globe by the paddles of war, his trajectory dictated entirely by forces beyond his control. While generals planned campaigns and politicians drew lines on maps, men like Yang were the human currency being spent. His story reminds us that beneath the grand strategies and the sweeping arrows of battle plans, the reality of war is intimate, personal, and overwhelmingly chaotic. It is the story of a single person trying desperately not to die, while the world around him insists on it. Some details of his life, particularly before his first capture, remain debated by historians, lost to the fog of war and the silence he maintained after it. But the core of his incredible journey is undisputed, verified by the military records of his captors. His life stands as a powerful refutation of the idea that war is a glorious enterprise. There was no glory for Yang Kyung-jong, only a sequence of ever-worsening nightmares. His life strips away the uniforms and the national anthems to reveal the raw, terrified human being at the center of the storm. In the end, Yang Kyung-jong's ultimate triumph was not surviving Khalkhin-Gol or Kharkiv or Normandy. It was the 40 years of peace he carved out for himself in a quiet corner of Illinois. He outlived the empires that had enslaved him. The Japanese Empire was dismantled. The Third Reich was reduced to ash. The Soviet Union crumbled just a year before his death. They were all relegated to the history books, while he was free to watch his children and grandchildren grow. He was not a hero of any nation, but a hero of the human spirit's stubborn, desperate will to simply live. His story is a chilling, essential reminder that the most profound consequence of war is not the territory gained or lost, but the individual lives irrevocably broken and sometimes miraculously remade. His final victory was not winning a war, but surviving it, and in doing so, telling a story more powerful than any battle ever could.